For more than 2,000 years, humanity has perceived Mary as the humble mother of Jesus, a simple woman from Nazareth, chosen by divine grace to give birth to the Savior of the world. However, if I told you that this version only partially reflects the truth, would you believe me? Have you ever wondered why there are so few lines in the Gospels describing Mary's life before the Annunciation? Why do we know almost nothing about her early years, upbringing, background, or the circumstances that prepared her for the most important mission in human history? The manuscripts preserved outside the official biblical canon reveal a completely different story. In this story, Maria appears not as a peasant girl frozen with fear, but as a woman whose preparation for her fate has been carefully thought out. She was a descendant of a sacred lineage, raised in the innermost secrets of the temple, and possessed knowledge beyond the ordinary. Maria possessed qualities that should have been inherent in any woman of that time. According to the Proto-Evangelium of James, one of the oldest surviving texts of Christianity, Mary was not an ordinary woman. Her very birth was predicted. Maria spent her childhood in the temple under the supervision of the most holy priests, and her education included knowledge accessible only to those who were initiated into the sacred mysteries. Researchers studying the Qumran manuscripts have found evidence of a special tradition about the chosen woman, which appeared in the Essene texts decades before the birth of Christ. This woman not only gave birth to the Messiah, but also actively participated in the establishment of the kingdom of heaven on earth. Why didn't this information get into the canonical Gospels? Why did the early church decide to present such a simplified version of a person who was undoubtedly the most important woman in the history of Christianity? The answer to this question takes us back to the first centuries. There was a period in the history of Christianity when church leaders were more focused on forming a single doctrine than on preserving all traditions associated with key figures of the faith. At this time, Mary's true personality, with all its complexity, training, and spiritual power, was simplified to a symbol of maternal modesty. However, the traditions preserved in the Eastern Christian communities tell us a different story. They tell the story of Mary, who was aware of the prophecies, was aware of her role in the divine plan, and consciously participated in events beyond our modern understanding of cooperation with the will of God. The oldest patristic texts, written by the church fathers who lived closest to the original events, contain references to aspects of Mary's life not mentioned in any canonical gospel. These references relate to visions, special knowledge, and spiritual authority possessed by Mary, even among the apostles. In Coptic manuscripts preserved in Egyptian monasteries, we find amazing stories about how Mary not only accompanied Jesus' public ministry, but also guided him in the most difficult moments. In these stories, she appears not just as a silent follower, but as a spiritual advisor whose voice was authoritative for everyone. But what about the manifestations of Mary that have occurred throughout history? Why does a woman who was believed to be just the mother of Jesus continue to give us messages that go far beyond maternal love? Why do her appearances always include prophecies of future events, knowledge of the mysteries of heaven, and teachings that enrich and deepen Christian doctrine? Modern science offers us unique tools to analyze these ancient texts in ways that were not available to previous generations. Linguistic analysis, carbon dating, and comparison of handwritten traditions open up new horizons for understanding these mysterious messages. All methods lead to the same conclusion. There was a much richer and more complex tradition about Mary than what has come down to us. This tradition portrays her not as a happy peasant woman, but as the culmination of a prophetic lineage going back to the patriarchs. She was a woman who was specially trained, educated, and dedicated to fulfilling a role that went far beyond biological motherhood. If you have ever felt that there was something else in Mary's story that did not match the simplified version we know, historical evidence confirms this. This worry in your heart has an explanation that has remained hidden for centuries. What you learn about the mother of Jesus will change everything you thought you knew about Christianity, the role of women in the divine plan, and the true nature of human cooperation with the sacred. However, the most shocking evidence of who Maria really was still remains hidden. They're about to open up. A prophecy has been discovered in the Qumran manuscripts that has gone unnoticed for decades. This is a detailed description of a woman in a sunny robe, which is also found in the Revelation of John, but with additional elements that have never been included in the biblical canon. According to the Essene texts preserved in the Dead Sea caves, this woman is not just a symbolic figure, but a real person with very specific features. She was supposed to be descended from David's paternal line, and also, most importantly, from Aaron's priestly line on his mother's side. Dr. James Robinson, head of the Nag Hammadi manuscript translation project, noted the amazing connection between the Essene prophecies about this chosen woman and the few details that the Gospels tell us about Mary. But the most striking coincidence lies in details that have never been mentioned in canonical texts, but are vividly evident in apocryphal traditions. It is not mentioned in the Gospels, but in the preserved traditions one can find interesting details related to Mary's mother, Anna. The Proto-Evangelium of James tells us that Anna was barren until a very old age, like Sarah, Abraham's wife, and Anna, Samuel's mother. According to preserved Jewish traditions, this infertility was not just an accident, but a prophetic sign that the child who would eventually be born would have an unusual fate. However, that's not all. The earliest patristic texts mention that during her pregnancy, Anna was given special visions. These visions reveal to her not only that her daughter would become the mother of the Messiah, but also that she herself must receive a special education in order to be ready for this mission. In the tradition preserved in the Syriac manuscripts, it is said that when Mary was born, there were signs in the sky that were interpreted by the Magi of the East, the very ones who later followed the star to the infant Jesus, the star above Bethlehem. According to these sources, Mary's birth was the first fulfillment of messianic prophecies, not the last. Why is this information not mentioned in the canonical Gospels? The answer can be found in the protocols of the Council of Nicaea, which took place in the 325th year of our Lord. The bishops gathered at this council had to determine which texts would be included in the official canon. The main criterion for them was not antiquity or historical authenticity, but usefulness in forming a unified doctrine. The texts, which portrayed Mary as a prophetically prepared and spiritually powerful figure, were considered too difficult for new converts to understand. It was easier to present her as an example of humility and obedience than to show her for what she really was, a woman who was ready to consciously participate in the divine plan. Today we live in an era when prophecies are coming true before our eyes, but many of us are still wandering in the dark, immersed in our own worries and doubts. For centuries, individual truths have been carefully hidden from humanity. But think about it. What if exactly those fragments that have been deleted from the Holy Scriptures contain the answers that you have been searching for years? Answers that can light up your path, strengthen your faith, and reveal the true purpose of Jesus' coming. But there is another interpretation that goes beyond simple biological motherhood. There is one surprising detail in the Gnostic text discovered at Nag Hammadi. They describe Mary as a person who knows the secret name of God. In the Jewish tradition, the possession of the secret name of God indicates a high level of spiritual dedication, accessible only to high priests and high prophets. How could a simple peasant woman from Nazareth get access to such knowledge? Or perhaps Maria was not just a peasant, but someone who had been preparing for the most important role in human history since childhood. The evidence points to an answer that completely changes our understanding of who Mary was before the Annunciation. This answer is preserved in traditions that have been passed down from generation to generation for 2 millennia and are waiting in the wings to reveal themselves. However, the prophecies were only the beginning of much deeper truths to be revealed. A more ancient and powerful family tree than one might assume based on the canonical Gospels. The Gospel of Luke, verse 136, contains a key that has gone unnoticed for centuries. When Angel Gabriel informs Mary that her relative Elizabeth is pregnant, he uses a special Greek word for close kinship. This word does not just mean relative, but implies belonging to the same family or clan. Why is this so important? In the same Gospel of Luke, in verse 1:5, it is clearly stated that Elizabeth was one of the daughters of Aaron. That is, she came from the purest priestly family of Israel. If Mary was a relative of Elizabeth, it means that she also belonged to the priestly line of Aaron. Researchers have discovered 4th century manuscripts in the Vatican archives containing detailed genealogies of Mary that were never included in the canonical Gospels. These genealogies, preserved in the Christian communities of Jerusalem before the destruction of the temple in the 70th year of our Lord, show that Mary came from the priestly family of Aaron. It is believed that Mary was a descendant of both David on her father's side and Aaron on her mother's side. This means that Jesus inherited not only the royal rule of David, but also the priestly authority of Aaron. In other words, Jesus was a legitimate king and high priest in full accordance with the strictest laws of Judaism, which was only possible if his mother belonged to a priestly family. Dr. Marvin Meyer, a specialist in Coptic texts from Chapman University, has documented how traditions preserved in Egypt describe Mary's family as guardians of temple secrets. According to these texts, Mary's father, Joachim, was not just a pious man, but also a member of the priestly class who had access to the holiest parts of the temple. The Syriac manuscripts kept in the monastery of St. Catherine contain a fascinating tradition. They describe how Joachim and Anna were blessed with visions of angels who gave them special instructions about their daughter's upbringing. They demonstrated that Mary was not an ordinary girl, but had been preparing to fulfill a prophetic destiny since childhood. The question arises, why was this information about Mary's priestly origin not included in the canonical Gospels? The documents of the Council of Ephesus, held in the 431st year of our era, give us the key to understanding this. The bishops discussed the divine nature of Christ, and some of them suggested that if the focus had been on Mary's priestly origin, it might have created the impression that Jesus' divinity depended on human factors. However, the preserved traditions indicate the opposite. God chose a woman from a priestly family for a special mission that goes beyond biological motherhood. During the life of Jesus, Mary was to serve as a priest, and after the crucifixion, she was to become an intercessor between heaven and earth. The texts written by the Holy Fathers of the 2nd century, especially the works of Justin Martyr and Irenaeus of Lyon, contain important information on this topic. The references to Mary as the new Eve and the Summa Sacerdotisa, the great priestess of the New Testament, were not just metaphors. They were based on traditions that revealed Mary's true origins and training. In the Babylonian Talmud, in the tractate Sanhedrin, there is a mysterious mention of a virgin from the house of David, who also belongs to the house of Aaron. Although this text was written by rabbis who rejected Christianity, it independently confirms that there was a Jewish tradition about a woman combining both lines. Have you ever heard of Mary's hidden priestly origins? Share your knowledge in the comments. I admire how much true seekers of truth like you know. Your experience can enlighten others who are just beginning to discover these revelations. The Nag Hammadi manuscripts contain a text called the Gospel of Mary, in which she is presented not as a follower of Jesus, but as a powerful woman with secret knowledge and power. This knowledge explains why, at the wedding in Cana, Jesus does not hesitate to obey his mother's suggestion. It was not just filial respect, but recognition of the spiritual authority that Mary rightfully possessed. Genealogical data preserved in the archives of the Greek Orthodox Church indicate that after Mary, several women from her family continued to hold leadership positions in early Christian communities, which may indicate her prominent role in the development of Christianity. To understand the origins of Jesus and Mary, we must recognize that they belong to a priestly lineage, which gave them legitimate spiritual authority. This sacred origin required training that official history has never mentioned, learning the deepest secrets of the temple, which began when Mary was just a little girl. The Proto-Evangelium of James reveals one of the most intimate secrets of Christian history. Mary did not grow up in Nazareth with her parents. At the age of 3, she was taken to a Jerusalem temple, where she lived until the age of 14. Under the direct supervision of Israel's holiest priests. Why has this important information never appeared in the canonical Gospels? And what exactly did Mary learn during these 11 years in the most sacred place of Judaism? According to the traditions preserved by Eastern Christian communities, Mary's education in the temple was not accidental. Her parents, Joachim and Anna, received clear instructions in their angelic vision. Their daughter had to devote herself completely to God from early childhood and receive knowledge that women usually did not possess at that time. The Syriac manuscripts from the monastery of St. Mark in Jerusalem contain detailed descriptions of Mary's daily routine in the temple. Every morning, before dawn, she took part in ritual prayers along with other dedicated virgins. During the day, she studied the scriptures under the guidance of priests who specialized in interpreting prophecies. But that wasn't all. According to the Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew, Mary had access to those parts of the temple that were closed even to many priests. An angel fed her every day, and even the priests recognized that there was a holiness in her that surpassed human understanding. Dr. April de Koning, an expert on early Christian texts from Rice University, has documented that stories about Mary's upbringing by the Templars are found in independent sources from different parts of the Eastern Mediterranean. This indicates that this is not just a local legend, but a historical memory preserved by many communities. Why was such an unusual training necessary? The Qumran manuscripts provide a fascinating clue. They describe how the chosen woman had to consciously cooperate with the divine plan. Mary was not just an instrument in the hands of God, she was a conscious accomplice. To do this, she needed knowledge that went far beyond the usual religious education. The Byzantine traditions preserved on Mount Athos tell us that Mary was fluent in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, which was unusual for a woman of any social status in the first century. But more importantly, she understood the prophetic connections between various sacred texts with such depth that it surprised even teachers and lawyers. The Armenian Gospel of Infancy contains a detail that has intrigued researchers for decades. It describes how Mary received a special vision at the age of 12. At the age of 12, Mary had a vision in which she saw the entire plan of salvation that would be realized through her participation. This vision did not frighten or confuse her. On the contrary, It prepared her for what was to come. Ethiopian manuscripts kept in the monasteries of Lalibela describe how Mary developed a special ability for mystical contemplation during her years in the temple. The priests noticed that during prayer, she often felt direct contact with heavenly realities. Georgian traditions tell us that Mary knew about the messianic prophecies in detail, far beyond the scope of ordinary knowledge. She understood not only what was going to happen, but also when, how, and what her specific role in each event would be. Why do the canonical Gospels completely exclude these formative years? The documents of the Council of Chalcedon of the 451st year of the Punxist show that some bishops expressed concern. If Mary's training and knowledge were overestimated, it might seem that her cooperation with God was not the result of grace, but of human merit. However, the preserved traditions indicate the opposite. The extraordinary preparation of the Virgin Mary was a manifestation of divine grace that allowed her to cooperate freely and consciously with a plan that transcends all human understanding. The patristic texts of the 3rd century, especially the writings of Origen and John Chrysostom, contain references to Mary as a virgin who was taught the mysteries, and that she knew the times and dates. These references become clear when we realize that Mary was specially prepared for prophetic interpretation and mystical contemplation. By the age of 14, when consecrated virgins usually left the temple to get married, Maria had already received an education that made her one of the most spiritually prepared people of her time. Her training immediately manifested itself in an event that would change world history. The secret teachings she received were not meant for an ordinary mother, but for someone who was about to take part in the most extraordinary encounter between the human and the divine that had ever taken place. The Gospel of Luke, chapter 1, verse 39, says that Mary immediately went to the Judean mountains to visit Elizabeth. But why the rush? And why, according to Luke, chapter 1, verse 41, was Elizabeth filled with the Holy Spirit at the very moment when Mary greeted her? The Syriac manuscripts kept in the monastery of Mar Gabriel contain an unusual tradition. The meeting between Mary and Elizabeth was not just a family visit, but a prophetic ritual of transferring spiritual power between the two women, representing the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New. According to the Gospel, Elizabeth, an Armenian by birth, had a dream 3 days before Maria's arrival. In this vision, it was revealed to her that the guest was not just a young relative, but the mother of the Lord. She had the honor of becoming the first person to officially recognize the identity of the Messiah. Patristic texts of the 2nd century describe this visit as a meeting of two prophetesses. Elizabeth represented the Old Testament prophecy, which was about to be fulfilled, and Mary symbolized the New Testament, which had just begun its history. Why did John the Baptist jump for joy while in Elizabeth's womb? The Coptic manuscripts of St. Anthony's monastery offer a fascinating explanation. John was spiritually aware of the presence of the Messiah, but more importantly, he understood that Mary was his conscious bearer, patroness. Elin Pagels, Princeton University, noticed that Mary's song, known as Magnificat, contains elements far beyond the simple expression of maternal gratitude. This is a prophetic prayer that testifies to a deep knowledge of the Holy Scriptures and a clear understanding of the cosmic meaning of what is happening. If these revelations resonate in your heart, I am happy to invite you to join our exclusive club. Here, you will meet a brotherhood of seekers who, like you, are not satisfied with superficial truths. Become a member today. Linguistic analysis of the Magnificat shows that Mary quotes or refers to more than 15 different passages from the Old Testament, combining them in such a way as to demonstrate not only academic knowledge, but also prophetic understanding. It's amazing how a 15-year-old girl could have such an aptitude for theological synthesis. The Ethiopian manuscripts preserved in Lalibela describe the Magnificat as the first prophecy of the New Testament, revealing to us a story told not by a male prophet, but by a woman specially trained to become the voice of God in the New World. Georgian traditions tell us that Elizabeth and Maria spent 3 months together, not just as relatives, but as spiritual mentors, sharing with each other revelations about the divine plan. Elizabeth told Mary about the prophecies that had come true, and Mary shared with Elizabeth visions of what was about to happen. The Gnostic texts found at Nag Hammadi offer an expanded version of this encounter, including full dialogues between the two women. In these dialogues, Mary demonstrates a knowledge of heavenly mysteries that goes far beyond ordinary human education. Why did the canonical Gospels limit this unusual encounter to just a few verses? The documents of the Council of Ephesus provide us with a key to understanding this issue. Some feared that too much attention to the prophetic communication between Mary and Elizabeth might create the impression that women had independent doctrinal authority. However, the preserved traditions show that this was exactly the case. These two female prophetesses acknowledged and confirmed the revelations they received about the divine plan. The manuscripts of St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai describe how, during their visit, Mary and Elizabeth simultaneously experienced visions of their children's future ministry. They not only saw John's preaching and Jesus' mission, but also experienced the crucifixion, resurrection, and founding of the church. The Proto-Evangelium of James tells us that when Mary returned to Nazareth after spending 3 months with Elizabeth, she changed. Those who knew Elizabeth noted that she had gained a previously unknown authority and wisdom. Mary's visit was not just a secular event, but a real prophetic dedication. The Armenian traditions preserved at St. Gregory's Monastery describe how Elizabeth passed on to Mary valuable teachings on how to cooperate with divine grace throughout pregnancy, childbirth, and the upbringing of the Son of God. These teachings were not based on human experience, but on heavenly revelations. This prophetic encounter prepared Mary for the next great event, birth, which would be not just the birth of a child, but the physical manifestation of God on earth. The canonical birth certificates of Jesus in Bethlehem tell only about the key points: the census, the journey, the nursery. However, the apocryphal texts, carefully preserved by early Christian communities, allow us to see that the birth of Mary was an event completely beyond the natural course of things. The Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew, for example, describes how Mary gave birth to a child in waters that were filled with light and fragrance. The Gospel of Matthew says that at the moment of the birth of Jesus Christ, the entire universe stopped to worship him. The animals in the fields froze, the birds stopped flying, the wind died down, and the rivers stopped at the time when the Savior came to the world. However, this is not just a poetic exaggeration. Researchers have found independent evidence of unusual astronomical phenomena that occurred precisely at the estimated time of Christ's birth. For example, astronomer Dr. Michael Molnar documented a certain planetary conjunction that could create a star visible from the east, as described in the Gospels. But there is even more convincing evidence. Coptic manuscripts kept in the monastery of St. Paul in Egypt tell how Joseph, having gone in search of a midwife, returned and found that the cave was filled with light exceeding sunlight. This light did not burn or flash suddenly, but filled everyone present with an indescribable peace. Syrian traditions tell us that Mary did not experience the usual birth pains. According to the Gospel of James, she remained in a state of contemplative prayer throughout the entire process, as if immersed in a cosmic ritual, rather than an ordinary biological event. The Ethiopian texts preserved in the monasteries of Lalibela contain a unique detail. They describe how, at the moment of her birth, Mary experienced a vision in which she saw all times and all generations that would be blessed through her son. She was not just a mother delivering babies, but a visionary who was aware of her participation in the most significant event in the history of mankind. The Armenian tradition preserved in the Echmiadzin monastery tells us that when Jesus was born, Mary did not need to cut his umbilical cord. He separated on his own, surrounded by golden light. The witnesses present froze in awe. Some interpreted this as a sign that this child would not depend on ordinary human food, but would be fed directly by divine power. However, these unusual details were omitted from the canonical Gospels. The documents of the Council of Chalcedon in the year 451 concerning the writings about Christ indicate that there were active discussions about how to present the humanity of Christ without belittling his divinity. If you include too many supernatural elements in the description of birth, you may get the impression that Jesus was not really human. The manuscripts of the monastery of St. Macarius in Egypt describe how Mary did not need physical recovery immediately after her birth. She immediately stood up, picked up the child in her arms, and began singing songs of praise, which, according to eyewitnesses, sounded as if they came straight from heaven. Georgian traditions tell us that the shepherds who came to worship the baby were more impressed by Mary than by the newborn Jesus himself. They said she radiated a holiness they had never seen in any human being before, and her words contained an authority that only God could give. The Arabic Gospel of Childhood contains a fascinating description of how Mary, in the first days after birth, demonstrated an intuitive knowledge of caring for the Son of God that went far beyond maternal instinct. She knew exactly when to feed him, when to let him sleep, and always took care of him with love and wisdom. In the text found at Nag Hammadi, the birth of Jesus is described as the moment when heaven and earth joined in Mary. They emphasize that God not only chose to be born of a woman, but also found someone who was able to consciously cooperate with the union of the divine and the human. Why didn't Maria show surprise or confusion when unusual birth-related events occurred? The Syriac manuscripts give us the answer. She was specially prepared for this during her stay in the temple. She knew the prophecies, understood their role, and consciously participated in the fulfillment of the divine plan. Coptic traditions have been preserved describing how, in the first days after birth, Mary received specific visions about her child's future. She saw his public ministry, his miracles, death, and resurrection, and consciously accepted every part of what was about to happen. Ancient texts describing the times when the Magi from the east came to worship a newborn baby are kept in the mountains of Mount Athos. According to these records, the Magi were not only amazed by the divinity of the child, but also delighted by Mary's spiritual wisdom. They offered to teach her Oriental secrets, but she replied that she already had all the necessary knowledge. An analysis of the oldest patristic texts shows that the birth of Jesus became a symbol of the transfiguration of Mary. Those who knew her before giving birth noted that after the birth of her son, she gained spiritual authority and prophetic knowledge that had not been there before. This transformation will become even more evident in the following years, when the Holy Family embarks on a journey to Egypt. Their journey had much deeper goals than just physical survival. The canonical Gospels tell us that Joseph, Mary, and Jesus fled to Egypt to escape Herod's persecution. However, the Coptic manuscripts preserved in Egyptian monasteries reveal a completely new story. The Holy Family did not just flee to Egypt, they were sent there on a specific mission. Where are you watching this video from? I am very glad that these truths are reaching thirsty souls all over the world. please specify your country or city. Let's create a global network of truth seekers. According to the ancient traditions preserved in the monastery of St. Anthony, the oldest monastery in Egypt, the Holy Family set off along a unique route. He led them to 7 ancient temples that had been centers of spiritual wisdom for thousands of years. It was not a desperate escape, but a pre-planned pilgrimage. The manuscripts of St. Paul's monastery describe how amazing phenomena occurred in every temple they visited. Pagan idols were destroyed by themselves, water sources were purified, and the Egyptian priests realized that they were in the presence of a higher divine power. But there is something more fascinating. According to Coptic traditions, Mary did not just accompany her son on this journey. In some temples, she communicated with Egyptian priests, showing a deep understanding of spiritual mysteries that caused them to tremble. How could a young Jewish mother master the secrets of Egyptian wisdom? The answer to this question is found in the text describing her upbringing in the Jerusalem temple. The most ancient priests of Israel preserved the knowledge passed down from generation to generation, including the wisdom received by Moses in the schools of the Egyptian mysteries. The manuscripts of St. Catherine's monastery in Sinai contain an unusual detail. They describe how, during her stay in Egypt, Mary received specific visions about the future ministry of Jesus. These visions revealed to him that his son would have to combine the wisdom of the East with the revelation of the God of Israel. The traditions preserved in the monastery of St. Macarius tell us that during the many years spent in Egypt, the infant Jesus was confronted with teachings that complemented his innate knowledge as the Son of God. It wasn't that he needed to find out the truth. The truth was already in him, but he needed to figure out how to bring this truth to humanity, which was influenced by numerous spiritual traditions. The Copts of the 3rd century describe how Mary, while in Egypt, gained a deep understanding of how universal wisdom manifests itself in different cultures. This understanding prepared her for the role of mentor during Jesus' public ministry. Why do the canonical Gospels completely ignore the details of what happened over the years in Egypt? The documents of the early councils indicate that there were concerns that overemphasizing the connection with Egyptian wisdom might confuse new Christians who are already familiar with the mystery religions. However, the surviving tradition suggests that God desired just such a synthesis, that his final revelation would include and surpass all the genuine wisdom accumulated by mankind over the centuries. The manuscripts of the monastery of the Virgin Mary in Asuta describe a specific event that forever changed Mary's worldview. While praying in the temple of Hermopolis, she had a vision in which she saw how all the true spiritual traditions of humanity were united in her Son. She realized that Jesus did not come to destroy man's desire for the divine, but to bring it to its highest point. Ethiopian traditions preserved in the Bible tell us that when the Holy Family was in Egypt, the infant Jesus was already showing signs of his divine nature, and Mary received special revelations about her son's future ministry. Eventually, the family returned to Nazareth, but Mary was completely transformed by the Egyptian experience. Everyone who knew her noted that she now possessed a deep understanding of the divine mysteries, an understanding that extended not only to the Jewish revelation, but also to universal wisdom. This transformation will be especially evident during Jesus' public ministry, when Mary will play a role that goes far beyond the usual role of a proud mother. The canonical Gospels mention Mary only a few times during Jesus' public ministry. However, apocryphal texts preserved in early Christian communities indicate that her role was much more significant than we were told in the official history. The 2011th verse of the second chapter of the Gospel of John contains amazing hints about Mary's true spiritual authority. When she addresses Jesus with the words, "They don't have wine," she doesn't just point to social problems. According to the Syriac manuscripts of the Mar Gabriel Monastery, she uses an encrypted phrase meaning, "It's time to show your strength." In response, Jesus replies, "Woman, what do I have to do with you? My hour has not yet come." The patristic texts of the 2nd century explain to us that Jesus discussed with Mary the exact prophetic time when he would begin his public manifestations. It was not a conversation between a mother and son, but between two participants in the divine plan who were aware of their role. The Coptic manuscripts of St. Anthony's Monastery describe how, immediately after this conversation, Mary turned to the servants. "Whatever he says to you, do it." According to these traditions, she knew exactly what was going to happen because she saw this moment in visions that she had many years ago. The Gnostic texts of Nag Hammadi also confirm this view. Some sources speak of Mary as a woman who has knowledge of times and dates. This implies that she was not only aware of the coming of the Messiah, but also understood the prophetic calendar of his ministry, and could also determine when the time would come for each specific event. The Armenian traditions preserved in Echmiadzin tell us that throughout the ministry of Jesus, Mary maintained a close relationship with the women who were part of the group of apostles. She was not only the mother of the teacher, but also served as a spiritual mentor for this community, preserving teachings that were not intended for the general public. The manuscripts of St. Catherine's Monastery describe how Mary possessed the gift of discerning spirits. The apostles often turned to her for advice when they had doubts about people close to the group, and her judgments always turned out to be correct. The question arises, why do the canonical Gospels not mention this key role of Mary in the ministry? The documents of the Council of Nicaea give us the answer to this question. There is a theory that there was concern that overemphasizing Mary's spiritual authority might create the impression that Jesus' ministry was based on human involvement rather than a pure manifestation of divinity. However, the traditions that have been preserved indicate that it was precisely this kind of conscious cooperation that God intended from the very beginning. The redemption of humanity requires the free and reasonable cooperation of all members of the human race. The Ethiopian texts that have come down to us describe several cases where Jesus secretly consulted Mary before making important decisions. It was not just a desire to receive human advice, but a desire to include his mother in the decision-making process that would have an impact on the future of all mankind. Georgian traditions tell us that during her ministry, Mary developed a unique ability to understand the parables of Jesus. The apostles often came to her to get into the essence of the teachings they were listening to. The Syriac manuscripts of the monastery of Mar Mamusa tell of Mary, who possessed the gift of prophecy, which she used unnoticed. She often foresaw what would happen in Jesus' ministry and unobtrusively prepared the disciples for future events. The surviving Coptic traditions describe how Mary had special power over demons and negative spiritual forces. When the apostolic group faced spiritual opposition, its presence immediately had a protective and cleansing effect. However, all the glory was attributed only to Jesus. This amazing role in the ministry was just a preparation for the most significant moment in human history, when Mary was about to perform the most heroic human act ever performed. John 19:25 simply tells us that they were standing at the cross of Jesus, his mother and his mother's sister, Mary Cleopas, and Mary Magdalene. However, the apocryphal texts preserved in Christian mystical communities reveal to us that what Mary experienced at the foot of the cross was much more than just the grief of a mother watching the death of her child. Have you ever felt that something important was being hidden from you about what really happened during the crucifixion? Share your experience. Your intuition may be closer to the truth than you think. According to the Gospel of Nicodemus, preserved in 2nd century manuscripts, Mary did not cry during the crucifixion. She remained standing in contemplative prayer. During the sacrifice she witnessed, Mary, according to eyewitnesses, seemed to offer her own heart along with her son's. The Syriac manuscripts of the Mar Gabriel Monastery contain an unusual tradition describing how, during her agony, Mary simultaneously experienced visions of what was happening in spiritual dimensions. She saw the cosmic battle between the forces of good and evil and realized that her maternal pain was an integral part of the victory of the light. The Coptic traditions preserved at St. Paul's Monastery tell us that when Jesus said, "Woman, behold thy son," referring to John, he was not just entrusting him with the care of a disciple. According to these texts, he officially transferred to her the maternal authority over all redeemed humanity. Why did he call her a woman instead of a mother? The patristic theologians of the 2nd century explain to us that at that moment, Mary ceased to be just the mother of Jesus and became a symbol of the unity of all mankind. She became a mother to all who believe in her Son. It was a mystical transformation that required a new way of understanding. The manuscripts of St. Catherine's Monastery tell how Mary prayed for the executioners and mocking onlookers during the crucifixion. Her prayer was not for revenge, but for forgiveness, which attests to her participation in the redemptive dynamic displayed by her Son. The Armenian traditions preserved in Echmiadzin tell us that Mary mystically felt some of the physical torments of the crucifixion. It was not just empathy, but real participation in the atoning sacrifice. Witnesses noted that at certain moments she seemed to share the sufferings of Christ. The Gnostic texts of Nag Hammadi contain a fascinating revelation. They describe how Mary received specific visions about the future of the church during the hours of the crucifixion. She saw the coming persecution, the martyrs who would shed their blood, and her own. The role of the intercessor in these moments of trial was central. Why do the canonical Gospels tell so little about what Mary experienced during the crucifixion? The documents of the first councils attest to the theological difficulties faced by the church fathers of that time. How can we explain that a simple woman could take such a deep part in the most significant event in history? However, the traditions that have come down to us show that participation in such an intimate story was conceived by God from the beginning. Redemption required not only a sacred sacrifice, but also cooperation in the heroic mission of humanity, represented in the image of Pura. The Ethiopian Lalibela manuscripts describe the exact moment of Jesus' death from Mary's point of view. According to these texts, she experienced such a deep, mystical union with her dying son that for a moment her soul left her body and was briefly taken to heaven to witness the triumphant ascent and acceptance of the soul of Christ. Georgian traditions tell us that when Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus removed the body of Jesus from the cross, Mary took him in her arms with the same calmness with which she received him in Bethlehem 33 years ago. Witnesses noted that she seemed to know something unknown to others. The Coptic texts of the monastery of St. Macarius contain an unusual detail. They describe how Mary, holding the dead body of Jesus in her arms, experienced a vision of his resurrection, which was to take place 3 days later. She wasn't just mourning her dead son, but she was silently keeping the secret of a life that would return. The manuscripts from Mount Athos tell how Mary, returning from the funeral, did not immediately go home. For the first few hours, she stayed at the Holy Sepulchre, praying not with despair, but with a mysterious expectation incomprehensible to other students. Syriac traditions tell us that in the hours between death and resurrection, Mary experienced visions of Christ's descent into hell and his return. The liberation of the righteous souls of the Old Testament was the main goal of Mary's life. She mystically participated in the entire redemptive work, and not just in that part of it that was visible on Golgotha. This mystical participation in the death of Christ prepared her for the role of a spiritual leader of a community that would preserve the deepest teachings, even those that had never been included in the canonical Gospels. The Acts of the Apostles briefly mentions that after the Ascension, the disciples were united in prayer with the women and with Mary, the mother of Jesus. However, this casual mention hides an extraordinary reality. Maria became the spiritual leader of a women's community that preserved teachings that had never been included in the official biblical canon. The Coptic manuscripts of St. Anthony's Monastery describe how, immediately after Pentecost, two levels of teaching were formed in the early Christian community. The apostles preached publicly to the crowd, while Mary led the inner circle. There were quite a few students who received deeper knowledge, according to the Syriac traditions that have come down to us through the monastery of Mar Gabriel. This special circle included not only Mary Magdalene and other women mentioned in the Gospels, but also dozens of others who secretly followed Jesus during his public ministry. This separate structure of education was necessary, as the patristic texts of the 2nd century explain to us. They say that Jesus gave his mother special knowledge about the nature of mystical union with God, knowledge available only to those who have undergone special spiritual training. The manuscripts of St. Catherine's Monastery contain fragments of what appears to be the secret teachings of Mary. These texts describe techniques of contemplative prayer, mystical interpretations of Jesus' parables, and revelations about life after death, which go far beyond what we find in the New Testament. The Armenian traditions preserved in Echmiadzin also testify to the existence of this special circle of women who follow Jesus. Ancient sources indicate that Mary had a unique gift for sharing her personal spiritual experiences with other women. She not only taught them theological concepts, but also gave them access to states of consciousness that allowed them to experience heavenly realities directly. The Gnostic texts of Nag Hammadi contain references to the School of Mary, a mystical educational center that operated in Jerusalem for decades. According to these documents, the disciples came from all over the Eastern Mediterranean to receive instruction from the mother of the Savior. However, this mystical school, led by Mary, was completely excluded from the official history of early Christianity. The documents of the Council of Ephesus, held in the 431st year of our era, shed light on this mysterious page. There was growing concern among male church leaders about the role of women in spreading the doctrine. However, the surviving traditions show us that Mary did not compete with the apostolic authority, but rather complemented it. The apostles focused their efforts on public preaching and church organization, while Mary devoted herself to a mystical and contemplative upbringing that would preserve the deeper aspects of the Christian experience. Lalibela's Ethiopian manuscripts describe how the women educated at Mary's school dispersed around the world, founding contemplative communities that preserved traditions not reflected in any canonical text. These communities became the source of many mystical traditions that flourished in the early centuries of Christianity. Georgian traditions tell us that Mary developed unique methods to help women in her circle experience visions of Jesus' life. With the help of meditation techniques she had learned over the years in the temple, these women could mystically experience events related to the ministry of Christ. The Coptic texts of St. Paul's Monastery contain descriptions of how Mary interpreted Christian teachings. Mary understood Jesus' words in a light that was inaccessible even to the apostles. Her understanding went beyond intellectual knowledge. It was a motherly insight that penetrated to the very essence of the teachings. The manuscripts from Mount Athos tell of weekly meetings where Mary shared with the students visions revealing the divine plan for humanity. These visions included revelations about the future of the church, the coming persecution, and the special role that female mystics would play in preserving the faith in difficult times. Syrian traditions tell us that Mary taught her disciples not only to pray for the living, but also to intercede for souls in purgatory. She developed a unique understanding of the connection between life on earth and life after death, which allowed her to serve both worlds simultaneously. The manuscripts of the monastery of St. Macarius describe how the women raised by Mary possessed unusual spiritual gifts: prophecy, healing, the ability to discern spirits and guide other souls in deep mystical experiences. This secret community existed throughout Mary's entire earthly life, preserving and transmitting the teachings that prepared the Church for understanding the most amazing event, her final transformation. The official testimonies of the Dormition of the Blessed Virgin Mary tell us that she fell asleep peacefully, after which her bodily ascension to heaven took place. However, the most ancient manuscripts preserved in Eastern monasteries describe an event that challenges our understanding of physical and spiritual laws. According to the Pseudo-Dionysius, a 4th century text preserved in the monastery of St. Sava in Jerusalem, Mary did not die an ordinary death. The apostles, who were miraculously transported from different parts of the world to be present at this event, testify to phenomena that can only be described as a gradual disappearance. The Syriac manuscripts of the Mar Gabriel Monastery tell us that during the 3 days preceding the Dormition of the Blessed Virgin Mary, Mary was in a state of consciousness, which eyewitnesses described as being both on earth and in heaven. She talked to the apostles present, but also had conversations with heavenly beings that only she could see. The Coptic traditions of St. Anthony's Monastery contain an unusual detail. Mary's body began to emit light, which gradually intensified during the days leading up to the Assumption. This light did not burn or dazzle, but turned everything it fell on into ashes. How can a physicist explain these seemingly impossible stories? Dr. Michael Paringer, a neurologist at Laurentian University, has discovered that electromagnetic fields can occur during moments of deep mystical experience that affect the environment. These phenomena are consistent with what modern science would call the transition between dimensions. In the patristic texts of the 3rd century, especially in the works of John of Damascus, the Dormition of the Virgin is described as the fulfillment of the promise made by Jesus to his mother during the appearance after the resurrection. According to these stories, Jesus revealed to her that she would be the first person to experience a bodily resurrection, the one that all saints would experience at the end of time. Armenian manuscripts preserved in Eshmiatzin state that during the Dormition of the Blessed Virgin Mary, Mary not only ascended to heaven, but also transformed into a form of existence that transcends the usual limitations of space and time. The apostles testified that one moment they saw her physical elevation, and the next they felt her presence completely surrounding them. Ethiopian traditions of slander tell how simultaneous phenomena occurred in different parts of the world at the exact time of the Dormition of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Saints and mystics who had never met Mary told of visions of a radiant woman speaking to them in their native language and imparting specific teachings to them. The manuscripts of St. Catherine's Monastery contain descriptions of the physical impact of the Dormition of the Blessed Virgin Mary on the surrounding space. Witnesses noted that the flowers in the garden where the event took place bloomed instantly. The fountains of water became crystal clear, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with energy, the likes of which they had never felt before. Why did it take centuries for the Church to officially proclaim the doctrine of the Assumption? The documents of the First Councils show that there was a difficulty in explaining how a person could undergo a transformation that, according to traditional theology, should occur only at the end of time. However, the surviving traditions indicate that Mary was specially prepared from birth to be the first to experience the form of existence intended by God for all redeemed humanity. Gothic texts found in Nag Hammadi describe the Assumption as the moment when matter and spirit were perfectly combined in one person. It was not Mary's ascension to heaven, but her achievement of a state of being in which the difference between heaven and earth ceased to exist. Georgian manuscripts kept in the Gelati monastery tell how the apostles tried to touch Mary's body during her transformation, but their hands passed through her, as if through a frozen light. However, she was able to touch them, blessing each one individually before completing her transition. Coptic traditions also tell us how Mary reached a state where her soul, filled with divine love, became part of a world of light and harmony. The monks from St. Paul's Monastery tell us that in the last minutes before the Dormition of the Blessed Virgin Mary, Mary revealed to the apostles an instant understanding of the mysteries that remained hidden throughout the entire ministry of Jesus. The witnesses claim that at that moment, they realized more than they had in 3 years of study. The texts from Mount Athos describe how, after Mary physically disappeared from sight, the apostles continued to feel her presence more acutely than when she was with them. They witnessed not a departure, but a transformation that made her presence more accessible, not less. Dr. Gary Schwartz of the University of Arizona has documented cases of transitional phenomena where people who were in deep mystical states were seen simultaneously in several places. The phenomena reported during the Dormition are consistent with what modern science is beginning to understand about the state of consciousness. The Syriac manuscripts of the Marmusa Monastery contain a fascinating description of how Mary, during the Dormition of the Blessed Virgin Mary, experienced an expansion of consciousness. This allowed her to see the entire history of mankind in an instant. She perceived the past, present, and future as a single, eternal moment, and realized her role as an advocate for all generations. Armenian traditions teach us that the Dormition of the Blessed Virgin Mary did not mark the end of Mary's active presence in the history of mankind, but opened a new form of service. Freed from the shackles of her physical body, she could simultaneously serve millions of souls around the world. The Ethiopian libel texts describe how, immediately after the Dormition of the Blessed Virgin Mary, reports of Mary's apparitions began to appear in different parts of the world. But these were not ordinary phenomena, but manifestations of someone who had reached a state of existence that allowed for simultaneous interaction with multiple dimensions of reality. The manuscripts of the monastery of St. Macarius contain testimonies of the apostles about the lasting consequences of witnessing the Dormition of the Most Holy Theotokos. They said that this event changed their understanding of eternal life and bodily resurrection. They saw the future of humanity embodied in one person. Coptic traditions tell us that after the Dormition of the Blessed Virgin Mary, Peter proclaimed that Mary had shown the way that all the saints would eventually follow. This happened not because she received a special privilege, but because she was the first to achieve the goal intended by God for all mankind. Patristic texts from the 4th century describe how the memory of the Dormition of the Blessed Virgin Mary became a source of extraordinary hope for early Christian communities. It was not only that she became a role model, but also that she was a symbol of hope for the future that awaits all believers. Not only was Mary rewarded for her faithfulness, but she also proved the truth of Christ's promises about the final transformation of matter. The manuscripts from the monastery of St. Catherine describe how, for centuries after the dormition of the Blessed Virgin Mary, Mary's apparitions occurred according to a certain scenario. They always happened at moments when humanity needed to remember its divine destiny and its ability to transform spiritually. Why does Mary continue to appear before humanity after 2,000 years? The preserved traditions give us the answer to this question. Her assumption was not a departure, but a transformation that allowed her to carry out a universal ministry that continues to this day. Modern quantum science is beginning to realize that consciousness is not limited by space and time, as we previously thought. The phenomena described in these legends are consistent with what theoretical physicists call quantum non-locality, the ability of conscious information to overcome the apparent limitations of space and time is truly an amazing phenomenon. The oldest manuscripts preserved in Eastern monasteries describe the dormition not as a separate supernatural event, but as the first manifestation of the physical laws that will govern the new world that Paul mentions in his letters. This transformation of Mary was the fulfillment of a special prophecy that is directly related to the events we are witnessing today. It reveals an eternal legacy that continues to transform people's lives to this day. For more than 2,000 years, Mary's apparitions have followed a certain prophetic pattern, which shows the continuity of the mission she began in Nazareth. From Guadalupe to Fatima, from Lourdes to Medjugorje, each demonstration carried the same message. Humanity is preparing for a transformation that will surpass everything we have known so far. Does Mary continue to have such a significant impact on our era? Prophetic manuscripts kept in Eastern monasteries cause us special awe because we are witnessing how her visions of the last times, received during the crucifixion, come true. According to the Coptic traditions of the monastery of St. Anthony, Mary not only observed the events that took place during the suffering of Christ, but also foresaw the entire history of the Church up to the Second Coming. She saw persecution, heresies, reforms, and wars, and also foreshadowed the last period when humanity would have to make a choice between spiritual transformation and self-destruction. Patristic texts from the 4th century describe how, after the dormition of the Blessed Virgin Mary, Mary received a special mission to prepare humanity for this crucial choice, not as a judge, but as a mother, aware of the divine potential of each of her children and striving to ensure that no one dies unknowingly. How can we know that Mary continues to lead humanity in our day? The manuscripts of St. Catherine's Monastery offer us several important criteria for understanding this. The global growth of mystical experiences, the emergence of spiritual movements that transcend traditional religious boundaries, the gradual revelation of truths that have remained hidden for centuries. The Armenian traditions preserved in Etchmiadzin describe our time as a time of great awakening, when the secrets that mystical communities have kept for 2 millennia will finally be revealed to all mankind. This awakening is taking place not only in Christianity, but in all the authentic spiritual traditions of the world. The Ethiopian Lalibela manuscripts contain specific prophecies of signs that indicate that Mary's mission is nearing its climax. Among these signs are the discovery of ancient texts that will change our understanding of the origins of Christianity, the convergence of science and spirituality, and the emergence of new religious movements. The current generation strives for a personal experience of contact with the divine, not limited to traditional doctrines. Doesn't this reflect the peculiarities of our time? In 1945, the Nag Hammadi manuscripts were discovered, and in 1947, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Quantum physics has revealed to us that reality works the way mystics have described it for millennia. Millions of people around the world are looking for a more direct and experimental path to spirituality. The surviving Gnostic texts tell us how Mary, being in the state after the dormition of the Blessed Virgin Mary, can communicate directly with souls who are ready for deeper revelations. Communication takes place not only through physical phenomena, but also through inspiration, synchronicity, and an inner voice that guides true seekers to the truths they need to discover. Georgian traditions claim that Mary has a special influence on seekers of truth, those who are not satisfied with superficial answers. In my quest for a deeper understanding, I am ready to question even the most established doctrines. Subscribe to our channel and activate the bell to not miss a single revelation. Don't miss our next video, in which we will continue to reveal the truths that have remained hidden for centuries. If you really want to delve into this topic, consider joining us as a member. The Guardians of Truth are already gaining access to knowledge that we will never be able to make public. Thank you for watching this video to the end. We'll meet next time. The Syriac manuscripts from Mar Gabriel Monastery describe how people, inspired by Mary's constant presence, experience an acceleration in their spiritual development, which goes far beyond what intellectual learning or ordinary religious practice can provide. How do I know that you are receiving this special guidance? The Coptic texts of St. Paul's monastery provide us with specific signs, an insatiable source of spiritual truth, the ability to intuitively distinguish between genuine and false teachings, a synchronous experience that seems to direct you to specific information, and a growing sense that there is a purpose in your life that transcends ordinary worldly concerns. The traditions of Mount Athos describe how Mary forms in our time, an invisible community of souls who, without necessarily knowing each other, are preparing to serve as bridges between ordinary consciousness and Christ consciousness during the upcoming transformation. The manuscripts of the monastery of St. Macarius contain a specific prophecy about the role that this invisible community will play. When the time comes for the final choice between spiritual evolution and material degeneration, these souls will serve as antennas that will help channel the transformation energies needed by humanity for the evolutionary leap. These energies become apparent in our time when the secrets associated with Mary are revealed. The texts of the Holy Fathers give us an understanding that humanity has reached the spiritual and intellectual maturity necessary to realize and comprehend the truths that in earlier times could have been misunderstood or misinterpreted. Coptic traditions describe our time as the time of final revelation, when all the secrets kept in different traditions will be combined into a single understanding that will prepare humanity for the next stage of its spiritual evolution. The oldest manuscripts preserved in Eastern monasteries describe this moment as the return of Sophia, the feminine divine wisdom that was partially hidden during the patriarchal era of mankind, but is now returning in its entirety to balance and complete the masculine revelation that has prevailed over the past 2 millennia. Mary, as the bearer and guardian of this Sophia from the moment of her conception, continues to guide the process of gradual unfolding, making sure that each soul receives exactly the truth that it can integrate at its current level of spiritual development. If you have watched this video to the end, if these revelations have found a response in your heart that goes beyond mere intellectual curiosity, perhaps you are part of the invisible community that Mary is creating for the times to come. The eternal legacy of the Mother of Jesus is not just ancient history, it is a living reality that continues to transform consciousness and prepare humanity for the divine destiny that has always been God's original plan. The canonical birth certificates of Jesus in Bethlehem give us only basic information about those events, but they reveal only a small part of what really happened. The birth of Jesus was an event that, according to apocryphal texts preserved in early Christian communities, completely contradicted the laws of nature. The Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew describes how, at the moment of birth, the entire creation stopped in awe. The animals in the fields froze, the birds stopped flying, the wind stopped, and even the rivers stopped flowing until Jesus came into the world. Although these descriptions may seem like poetic exaggerations, the researchers found independent references to unusual astronomical phenomena that occurred precisely at the supposed time of Christ's birth. Astronomer Dr. Michael Molnar has documented a special planetary conjunction that could create a star visible from the east, as described in the Gospels. However, there is more convincing evidence. Coptic manuscripts, which may have been written shortly after the birth of Christ, contain descriptions of a miraculous star rising, further confirming this version. There are documents in the monastery of St. Paul in Egypt that describe how Joseph, after going in search of a midwife, returned to find that the cave was filled with light exceeding sunlight. This light did not burn or flash suddenly, but filled everyone present with an indescribable peace. Syrian traditions indicate that Mary did not experience the usual birth pains. According to the Gospel of James, she remained in contemplative prayer throughout the entire process, as if she were participating in a cosmic ritual rather than an ordinary biological event. The Ethiopian texts found in the monasteries of Lalibela contain an extraordinary detail. They tell how, at the moment of her birth, Mary experienced a vision in which she saw all times and all generations that would be blessed through her son. She was not just a mother delivering babies, but also a seer who consciously participated in this sacred process. The Echmiadzin Monastery preserves the Armenian tradition that tells about the birth of Jesus Christ, the most important event in the history of mankind. According to this tradition, when Jesus was born, Mary did not need to cut his umbilical cord. She separated herself, and the baby was surrounded by golden light. The witnesses present took this as a sign that this child would not depend on ordinary human nutrition, but would be fed directly by divine power. However, these unusual details were not included in the canonical Gospels. The documents of the Council of Chalcedon, held in the 451st year of our Lord, testify to the intense debate about how to present the humanity of Christ without belittling his divinity. The inclusion of too many supernatural elements in the birth story could have given the impression that Jesus was not truly a human being. The manuscripts of the monastery of St. Macarius in Egypt describe how Mary did not need physical recovery immediately after her birth. She immediately got up, picked up the child in her arms, and began singing songs of praise that, according to eyewitnesses, seemed to come straight from heaven. Georgian traditions tell us that the shepherds who came to worship the baby were more impressed by Mary than by the newborn Jesus himself. They said that she shone with a holiness that they had never seen in humans before, and that her presence had an authority that only God can give. The Arabic Gospel of Childhood offers a fascinating description of how Mary, in the first days after birth, showed an intuitive understanding of how to take care of the Son of God, an understanding that went far beyond the usual maternal instinct. She knew exactly when to feed him, when to let others touch him, and how to protect him from negative spiritual influences. In the Gnostic texts of Nag Hammadi, the birth of Jesus is described as the moment when heaven and earth joined in Mary. It was no accident that God chose to be born of a woman. He found someone who was able to consciously cooperate with this union of the divine and the human. Why did Maria not show surprise or confusion before the extraordinary events surrounding the birth of a child? The Syriac manuscripts offer a clear answer to this question. Coptic traditions that have come down to us tell us that in the first days after birth, Mary received revelations about the future of her child. She saw his public ministry, miracles, death and resurrection, and realized every step that had to take place. The manuscripts found on Mount Athos describe how the Magi from the east came to worship the baby. These texts indicate that the Magi were amazed by Mary's spiritual wisdom, no less than by the divinity of the child. They offered to teach her Oriental secrets, but she replied that she already knew everything she needed to know. An analysis of the most ancient patristic texts shows that the birth of Jesus was the beginning of Mary's spiritual transformation. Those who knew her before she gave birth noted that after they gave birth, she gained new spiritual authority and prophetic knowledge that she had not had before. This transformation will become even more pronounced in the following years when the Holy Family embarks on a journey to Egypt, a journey that pursues deeper goals than just physical survival. The canonical Gospels tell us that Joseph, Mary, and Jesus fled to Egypt to escape Herod's persecution. However, the Coptic manuscripts preserved in Egyptian monasteries tell us a completely different story. The Holy Family did not just flee to Egypt, they were sent there to fulfill a specific mission. Where are you watching this video from? I am very glad to learn that these truths are reaching thirsty souls all over the world. Specify your country or city. Let's create a global network of truth seekers. According to the traditions that have been preserved in Egypt's oldest monastery of St. Anthony, the Holy Family took a very unusual route. The journey that took them to the 7 ancient temples that had served as centers of spiritual wisdom for thousands of years, was not just a trip, it was a planned pilgrimage. The manuscripts of St. Paul's Monastery tell how amazing events took place in every temple they visited. Pagan idols were destroyed by themselves, water sources were purified, and Egyptian priests realized the presence of a higher divine power. But there is something more fascinating. Coptic traditions indicate that Mary was not just a companion on this journey. In several temples, she communicated with Egyptian priests, showing a deep knowledge of spiritual mysteries that made them tremble. How could a young Jewish mother master the secrets of Egyptian wisdom? The answer to this question is found in the text describing her upbringing in the Jerusalem temple. The most ancient priests of Israel preserved knowledge dating back to the time of Moses, knowledge that included the wisdom that Moses had learned in the mystical schools of Egypt. The manuscripts of St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai contain an amazing detail. They describe how Mary, while in Egypt, received clear visions about the future ministry of Jesus. These visions showed her that her son would have to combine the wisdom of the East with the revelation of the God of Israel. The traditions preserved in the monastery of St. Macarius tell us that during the many years he spent in Egypt, the infant Jesus was open to teachings that complemented his innate knowledge as the Son of God. It wasn't that he needed to find out the truth, it was in himself, but he needed to figure out how to bring this truth to humanity, which was influenced by numerous spiritual traditions. Coptic texts from the 3rd century describe how Mary, while in Egypt, developed a deep understanding of how universal wisdom manifests itself in various cultures. This understanding prepared her for the role of mentor during Jesus' public ministry. Why are the canonical Gospels completely silent about what happened in Egypt over the years? The documents of the first councils indicate that there were concerns. If too much emphasis was placed on the connection with Egyptian wisdom, converts could mistake Christianity for one of the mystical religions they already knew. However, the surviving traditions show us that God desired just such a synthesis, that his final revelation would include and transcend all the genuine wisdom accumulated by mankind over the centuries. The manuscripts of the monastery of the Blessed Virgin Mary in Asuta describe a specific event that forever changed Mary's life and worldview. While praying in the temple of Hermopolis, she had a vision in which she saw how all the true spiritual traditions of humanity were united in her Son. She realized that Jesus did not come to break man's desire for the divine, but to bring it to its highest point. Ethiopian traditions preserved in ancient texts tell us that when the Holy Family finally returned to Nazareth, Mary was transformed by the Egyptian experience. Those who knew her noted that she now possessed a deep understanding of the divine mysteries that were for her not only a Jewish revelation, but also universal wisdom. This transformation would have been especially pronounced during Jesus' public ministry, where Mary would have played a role far beyond that of a proud mother. The canonical Gospels mention Mary only a few times during Jesus' public ministry, but the apocryphal texts preserved in early Christian communities show us that her role was much more significant than the official history told us. Why does Jesus answer, "Woman, what do I have to do with you? Has my hour not yet come?" The patristic texts of the 2nd century explain to us that Jesus discussed with Mary the exact prophetic time when his public miracles would begin. It was not a conversation between a mother and son, but between two conscious participants in the divine plan. Coptic manuscripts confirm this interpretation. The monastic traditions of Saint Anthony tell us that immediately after this conversation, Mary turned to the servants with the words, "Whatever he says to you, do it." According to these legends, she knew exactly what was going to happen because she saw this moment in visions that visited her many years ago. Gnostic texts found at Nag Hammadi mention Mary as a person who knows the times and deadlines. This indicates that she not only realized that Jesus was the Messiah, but also understood the prophetic plan of his ministry. She could determine exactly when the time would come for each individual manifestation of his mission. Armenian traditions, which are still carefully preserved in Echmiadzin, tell us that throughout the time devoted to the ministry of Jesus, Mary maintained close contact with the women who followed the apostolic group. She was not only the mother of her teacher, but also a spiritual mentor for this sorority, which kept faith and devotion to its spiritual leader. Why do the canonical Gospels not tell about the important role of Mary in the ministry of Jesus? The documents of the Council of Nicaea give us the answer to this question. There were concerns that if Mary's spiritual authority was overemphasized, it might give the impression that Jesus' ministry depended on human involvement rather than being a pure manifestation of divinity. However, the preserved traditions show that it was precisely this kind of conscious cooperation that God intended from the very beginning. The redemption of humanity required the free and reasonable interaction of representatives of the human race. The Ethiopian texts found in the hymns describe several moments during the ministry when Jesus privately consulted with Mary before making important decisions. It wasn't that he needed human advice. Rather, he wanted his mother to be aware of her involvement in decisions that would determine the future of humanity. Georgian traditions also emphasize the importance of Mary's role in the ministry of Christ, claiming that she was his faithful companion throughout the journey. Ancient sources tell us that Mary, during her ministry, had a unique ability to interpret the parables of Jesus. The apostles often turned to her, seeking to comprehend the deeper meaning of the teachings they had heard. The Syriac manuscripts of the Marmamusa monastery describe Mary as a prophet who, however, used her gift unnoticed. She often foresaw the events that awaited Jesus in his ministry and prepared the disciples for the coming changes. The fascinating Gospel of Philip discovered in Nag Hammadi, mentions Mary as the Savior's companion, not in a romantic but in a spiritual sense, as a partner in the work of redemption. According to this text, Jesus loved her more than all the disciples because she was fully aware of the cosmic dimension of her mission. The surviving Coptic traditions tell us that Mary had special power over demons and negative spiritual forces. When the apostolic group faced spiritual opposition, it was she who came to their aid. Her presence instantly created a protective and cleansing effect. However, all this amazing role in the ministry was just a preparation for the most significant moment in human history, when Mary was to demonstrate the greatest human cooperation ever witnessed. In the Gospel of John, chapter 19, verse 25, it says that at the cross of Jesus stood his mother's sister, Mary, wife of Cleopas, and Mary Magdalene. However, the apocryphal texts that have been preserved by Christian mystical communities reveal to us that Mary's experience at the foot of the cross was much deeper than just the grief of a mother watching the death of her son. Have you ever felt that something was being hidden from you about what happened during the crucifixion? Share your experience. Perhaps your intuition is much closer to the truth than you think. According to the Gospel of Nicodemus, which has been preserved in 2nd century manuscripts, Mary did not cry during the crucifixion. During the crucifixion, Mary stood in contemplative prayer, as if mystically participating in the sacrifice. Witnesses said it was as if she was offering her own heart along with her son's. The Syriac manuscripts from the monastery of Mar Gabriel contain an extraordinary tradition. They describe how Mary, during 3 hours of agony, simultaneously saw events taking place in spiritual dimensions. She watched the cosmic battle between the forces of good and evil, and realized that her maternal pain was an integral part of the victory of the light. The Coptic traditions preserved at St. Paul's Monastery tell us that when Jesus said, "Woman, here is your son," referring to John, he was not just entrusting him with the care of a disciple. According to these texts, he officially handed over to her the maternal authority over all redeemed humanity. Why did he call her that? How could you call her a woman instead of a mother? The texts of the Holy Fathers written in the 2nd century explain to us that at that moment Mary ceased to be just the mother of Jesus, but became the universal mother for all who would believe in her Son. It was a mystical transformation that required a new way of addressing it. The manuscripts of St. Catherine's Monastery describe how, during the crucifixion, Mary specifically prayed for the executioners and priests who mocked him. Her prayer was not for revenge, but for forgiveness, and thus she participated in the same redemptive dynamic that her son displayed. The Armenian traditions preserved in Echmiadzin tell us that Mary mysteriously experienced some of the physical torments of crucifixion. It was not just maternal sympathy, but real participation in the redemptive sacrifice. Witnesses noted that at certain moments, she seemed to literally share the sufferings of Christ. The Gnostic texts found at Nag Hammadi contain a truly fascinating revelation. They tell how, during the hours of the crucifixion, Mary received clear visions about the future of the Church. She foresaw the coming persecution, the torment of those who would shed their blood, and her own role as an advocate in these difficult times. Why don't the canonical Gospels tell us more about what Mary experienced during the crucifixion? The documents of the First Councils attest to the theological complexity associated with this issue. How can we explain how a simple woman could be so close to the most important redemptive event in history? However, the surviving traditions show that this intimate participation was part of God's plan. Redemption required not only divine sacrifice, but also the heroic cooperation of humanity, represented in its purest form. The Ethiopian manuscripts describe the exact moment of Jesus' death from Mary's point of view. According to these texts, she experienced such a deep, mystical union with her dying son that for a moment she became unaware of her body and herself. At that moment, Mary's soul also left her body and was briefly lifted up to heaven to witness the triumphant acceptance of the soul of Christ. Georgian traditions tell us that when Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus removed the body of Jesus from the cross, Mary took him into her arms with the same calmness with which she received him in Bethlehem 33 years ago. Witnesses noted that she seemed to know something beyond the comprehension of others. The Coptic texts from the monastery of St. Macarius contain a unique detail. They describe how Mary, holding the dead body of Jesus in her arms, experienced a vision of his resurrection, which was to take place 3 days later. She not only mourned her dead son, but also silently kept the secret of the life that was about to return. The manuscripts from Mount Athos tell us that after the burial, Mary did not immediately return home. For the first few hours, she stayed by the grave, praying not with despair, but with a mysterious expectation that others did not share. The disciples could not comprehend this. According to Syriac traditions, in the hours between death and resurrection, Mary experienced visions related to the descent of Christ into hell and the liberation of the righteous souls of the Old Testament. She mystically participated in the entire redemptive work, and not just in that part of it that was visible on Golgotha. This mystical participation in the death of Christ prepared her to become the spiritual leader of a community that would preserve the most profound teachings ever recorded in the canonical Gospels. The Acts of the Apostles briefly mentions that after the Ascension, the disciples were unanimous in prayer and communion with the women and Mary, the mother of Jesus. Chapter 1, verse 14. However, this casual mention hides an incredible reality. Maria became the spiritual leader of a women's community that preserved teachings that had never been included in the official biblical canon. The Coptic manuscripts of St. Anthony's Monastery describe how 2 levels of this community were formed immediately after Pentecost. The teaching in the early Christian community was divided as follows. The apostles preached publicly to the crowd, while Mary led a closed circle of female students, where they received deeper knowledge. According to the Syriac traditions preserved at Mar Gabriel Monastery, this women's circle included not only Mary Magdalene and other women mentioned in the Gospels, but also dozens of others who secretly followed Jesus during his public ministry. The need for a separate learning structure was due to the fact that Jesus passed on to his mother special knowledge about the nature of mystical union with God, which required special spiritual training to understand. The patristic texts of the 2nd century explain to us that this knowledge was passed on by the mother, not the son, which emphasizes its exceptional character and importance for understanding and developing the Christian faith. The manuscripts of St. Catherine's Monastery contain fragments that are believed to be the secret teachings of Mary. These texts describe techniques of contemplative prayer, mystical interpretations of Jesus' parables, and revelations about the nature of life after death that go far beyond what we find in the New Testament. The Armenian traditions preserved in Echmiadzin tell us that Maria had the ability to convey direct spiritual experiences to women from her environment. She not only taught them theological concepts, but also provided them with access to states of consciousness that allowed them to personally experience heavenly realities. The Gnostic texts of Nag Hammadi contain references to the School of Mary as a mystical learning center that operated in Jerusalem for decades. According to these documents, students came from all over the Eastern Mediterranean to receive instruction from the Mother of the Savior. After all, this mystical school, headed by Mary, was completely excluded from official history. The documents of the Council of Ephesus, adopted in the 431st year of our era, shed light on the role of women in early Christianity. There was growing concern among men in leadership positions in the church about women's place in spreading the doctrine. However, the preserved traditions indicate that Mary did not compete with the apostolic authority, but rather complemented it. The apostles focused on public preaching and church organization, while Mary devoted herself to a mystical and contemplative upbringing that fostered a deeper understanding of the Christian experience. Libella's Ethiopian manuscripts describe how the women educated at Mary's school dispersed throughout the known world, founding contemplative communities. These communities preserved traditions that were not recorded in any canonical text. They became the source of many mystical traditions that flourished in the early centuries of Christianity. Georgian traditions tell us that Maria developed a special approach to education, which became the basis for the creation of mystical schools. Using special methods, Mary helped women in her circle experience visions of Jesus' life. The meditation techniques she had learned over the years in the temple allowed them to experience events related to the ministry of Christ in a mystical way. The Coptic texts of St. Paul's monastery describe how Mary interpreted the words of Jesus, revealing meanings that were inaccessible even to the apostles. Her understanding went beyond mere intellectual knowledge. It was a motherly understanding that penetrated to the very essence of the teachings. The manuscripts from Mount Athos tell of weekly meetings where Mary shared with her students visions of the divine plan for humanity. These visions included revelations about the future of the church, the coming persecution, and the special role that female mystics would play in preserving the faith in dark times. Syrian traditions tell us that Mary taught her students not only to pray for their loved ones, but also to inspire them so that they could go through trials and preserve their faith. Saint Macarius, being a deeply religious man, possessed the gift not only to heal, but also to intercede for souls in purgatory. He created a unique vision of the relationship between earthly life and life after death, which allowed him to serve both worlds simultaneously. The manuscripts of the monastery of St. Macarius tell us that the women raised by Mary possessed special spiritual gifts: prophecy, healing, discernment of spirits, and the ability to guide other souls into deep mystical experiences. This secret community existed throughout Mary's earthly life, preserving and transmitting the teachings that prepared the Church to understand the most unusual event, the final transfiguration of Mary. The official testimonies of the Dormition of the Most Holy Theotokos tell us that death was followed by bodily ascension to heaven. However, the most ancient manuscripts preserved in Eastern monasteries describe an event that goes beyond our usual understanding of physical and spiritual laws. According to the Pseudo-Melaton, a 2nd century text preserved in the monastery of St. Sava in Jerusalem, Mary's death was unusual. The apostles, who were miraculously transported from different parts of the world to be present at this event, said that Mary's falling asleep was preceded by phenomena that can only be described as gradual dematerialization. Syriac manuscripts from the monastery of Mar Gabriel describe how during the 3 days preceding the Dormition of the Blessed Virgin Mary, Mary was in a state of consciousness, which witnesses described as being both on earth and in heaven. She communicated with the apostles present, but also had conversations with heavenly beings that only she could see. The Coptic traditions from St. Anthony's Monastery contain a unique detail. They describe how Mary's body began to emit light, which gradually intensified over the course of several days before the Assumption. This light didn't burn, but it changed everything it touched. Can a physicist explain these incredible stories? Dr. Michael Persinger, a neurologist at Laurentian University, has documented that deep mystical states can generate electromagnetic fields that affect the surrounding space. The phenomena described in the legend correspond to what modern science would call a transition between dimensions. The patristic texts of the 3rd century, especially the writings of John of Damascus, describe the Dormition as the fulfillment of Holy Scripture, the promise that Jesus made to his mother during the appearance after the resurrection. According to these accounts, Jesus revealed to her that she would be the first person to experience bodily resurrection, which awaits all saints at the end of time. The Armenian manuscripts preserved in Echmiadzin also confirm this idea. Official documents tell us that during the dormition of the Most Holy Theotokos, her dormition took place, and then her bodily ascension to heaven. However, according to the oldest manuscripts preserved in the monasteries of the East, an event occurred that goes beyond our understanding of physical and spiritual laws. A pseudo-text from the 4th century, preserved in the monastery of Saint Sava in Jerusalem, indicates that Mary did not die an ordinary death. The apostles, miraculously transported from different parts of the world, testified that their dormition was preceded by phenomena that can only be described as gradual dematerialization. The Syriac manuscripts of the Mar Gabriel Monastery describe how, 3 days before the dormition of the Blessed Virgin Mary, Mary experienced a state of consciousness that witnesses described as being on earth and in heaven at the same time. The Christian tradition describes how the Most Holy Theotokos, while in heaven, communicated with the apostles and had conversations with heavenly beings who were visible only to her. The Coptic traditions of St. Anthony's Monastery contain an unusual detail. They tell how Mary's body began to emit light, the intensity of which gradually increased during the several days preceding her Assumption. This light was not blinding and did not flash suddenly, but it transformed everyone who looked at it. What physical phenomenon can explain these seemingly impossible stories? Dr. Michael Persinger, a neuroscientist at Lawrence University, has documented how deep mystical states can generate electromagnetic fields, which affect the environment. The phenomena described in these legends are consistent with what modern science would call a dimensional transition. Patristic texts of the 3rd century, especially the writings of John of Damascus, describe the dormition of the Most Holy Theotokos as the fulfillment of Holy Scripture and a specific promise that Jesus made to his mother during the appearance after the resurrection. According to these accounts, Jesus revealed to her that she would be the first person to experience a bodily resurrection, foreshadowing the resurrection of all saints at the end of time. The Armenian manuscripts kept in Echmiadzin tell us that during the dormition, Mary not only ascended to heaven, but turned into a form of existence that transcended the usual limitations of space and time. The apostles testified that one moment they saw her physically rising, and the next, they already felt her presence, which completely surrounded them. Ethiopian traditions describe how, at the exact time of the dormition of the Blessed Virgin Mary, phenomena occurred simultaneously in different parts of the world. Saints and mystics who had never met Mary reported their experiences at that moment. They talked about the visions of a beautiful woman who spoke to them in their native language and conveyed important teachings to them. In the manuscripts of St. Catherine's Monastery, one can find descriptions of how the dormition of the Blessed Virgin Mary affected the world around them. Witnesses said that the flowers in the garden where this event took place instantly bloomed. The fountains of water became crystal clear, and the air seemed to vibrate with energy that they had never felt before. Why did it take the Church so long to officially adopt the doctrine of the Assumption? As the documents of the first councils attest, there were difficulties in explaining how a person could achieve a transformation, the one that, according to traditional theology, should occur only at the end of time. However, Surviving traditions indicate that Mary was specially prepared from the moment of her conception to become the first to experience the form of existence intended by God for all redeemed humanity. Gnostic texts from Nag Hammadi describe the Assumption as the moment when matter and spirit are perfectly combined in one person. This does not mean that Mary was taken to heaven. It means that she has reached a state of being in which the differences between heaven and earth no longer exist. Georgian manuscripts kept at the Gelati monastery indicate that the apostles tried to touch Mary's body during the Transfiguration, but their hands passed through her. It was as if she was floating in a frozen light, and at the same time she could touch each of them, blessing them before completing their journey. According to the Coptic traditions of St. Paul's Monastery, in the last moments of the life of the Blessed Virgin Mary, addressing the apostles, conveyed to them an instant understanding of the mysteries that remained hidden throughout the ministry of Jesus. The witnesses say that they realized more in one moment than in 3 years of training. The texts from Mount Athos describe how after Mary disappeared from their field of vision, the apostles continued to feel her presence more acutely than when she was physically near them. They witnessed not a departure, but a transformation, one that made her presence more accessible, not less. Dr. Gary Schwartz from the University of Arizona has documented cases of modern transitional phenomena when people, being in deep mystical states, were seen simultaneously in several places. During the Dormition, according to legend, Mary experienced an amazing expansion of consciousness. It allowed her to see the entire human history in a single, eternal moment. She realized her role as an advocate for all generations. Armenian traditions affirm that the Dormition of the Blessed Virgin Mary was not the end of Mary's active participation in the history of mankind, but the beginning of a new form of service, freed from the limitations of the physical body. Now she could serve millions of souls all over the world at the same time. The Ethiopian Kebra Nagast texts describe how, immediately after the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary, reports of Mary's apparitions began to appear in different parts of the world. But these were not common occurrences. These phenomena were the manifestations of someone who had reached a state of existence that allowed them to interact with multiple dimensions of reality simultaneously. The manuscripts of the monastery of St. Macarius contain testimonies of the apostles about the long-term consequences of witnessing the Dormition of the Blessed Virgin Mary. They said that this event changed their understanding of eternal life and bodily resurrection. They saw the future of humanity embodied in one person. Coptic traditions tell us that after the Dormition of the Most Holy Theotokos, Peter declared that Mary had shown the way that all the saints would eventually follow. Not that she received a special privilege, but that she was the first to achieve the goal intended by God for all mankind. Modern quantum science is beginning to realize that consciousness is not limited by space and time in the way it was previously thought. We used to think otherwise. The events described in this hypothesis are consistent with what physics theorists call quantum non-locality, the ability of conscious information to overcome the apparent limitations of space and time. Mary's transformation was the fulfillment of a prophecy that is directly related to modern events. It reveals an eternal legacy that continues to change lives to this day. For more than 2,000 years, Mary's apparitions have followed a certain prophetic pattern, which demonstrates the continuation of the mission begun by Mary in Nazareth, from Guadalupe to Fatima, from Lourdes to Medjugorje. Each demonstration carried the same message. Humanity is preparing for a transformation that will surpass anything we have known before. Why does Maria keep appearing so often nowadays? Prophetic manuscripts kept in Eastern monasteries give us an unusual answer, because we are witnessing the fulfillment of the visions that she received during the crucifixion of Christ. Visions of the last days. According to the tradition of the Coptic monastery of St. Anthony, Mary not only saw the immediate events, but also the entire history of the Church up to the moment of the Second Coming. She foresaw persecution, heresies, reforms, and wars, as well as the final period of time when humanity must make a choice between transformation and spiritual self-destruction. Texts dating back to the patristic centuries of the 2nd and 4th centuries describe how, after the Dormition, Mary received a special mission to prepare humanity for this crucial choice. She did not act as a judge, but was a mother who realized the divine potential of each of her children and sought to prevent their loss through ignorance. How can we recognize the signs that Mary continues to lead humanity in our day? The manuscripts of St. Catherine's Monastery provide us with specific criteria: the global growth of mystical experiences, the emergence of spiritual movements that transcend traditional religious boundaries, and the gradual discovery of truths that have remained hidden for centuries. The Armenian traditions, carefully preserved in Echmiadzin, represent our time as a period of great awakening, when the secrets that have been kept in mystical communities for centuries will finally become the property of all mankind. This awakening is taking place not only in Christianity, but in all the authentic spiritual traditions of the world. The Ethiopian Libella manuscripts contain specific prophecies of signs that will indicate the approach of the culmination of Mary's mission. Among them are the discovery of ancient texts that will change our understanding of the origins of Christianity, the convergence of science and spirituality, as well as the emergence of a generation seeking direct experience of the divine instead of agreeing with traditional doctrines. Aren't these the features of our time? In 1945, the Nag Hammadi manuscripts were discovered, and in 1947, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. Quantum physics has confirmed that reality functions in ways that mystics have described for thousands of years. Millions of people around the world are striving for a more direct and experimental experience of spirituality. The Gnostic texts that have survived to this day describe how Mary, being in a state close to trance, can communicate with souls who are ready for deeper knowledge. This communication takes place not only through physical phenomena, but also through inspiration, synchronicity, and an inner voice that guides true seekers to the truths necessary to discover them. Georgian traditions show that Mary has a special influence on those who are not satisfied with superficial answers and are ready to question even the most established doctrines in an effort to gain a deeper understanding. The Syriac manuscripts of the Mar Gabriel Monastery tell us how people attuned to Mary's constant presence experience an acceleration of their spiritual development, a development that goes far beyond the possibilities of intellectual study or ordinary religious practice. How do I know that you are receiving this special guidance? The Coptic texts of St. Paul's Monastery give us valuable clues. An unquenchable thirst for spiritual truth. The ability to intuitively distinguish between genuine and false teachings. Synchronous experiences that seem to lead you to certain information. A growing sense that there is a purpose in your life that goes beyond the ordinary mundane concerns. The traditions of Mount Athos tell us how, in our time, Mary forms an invisible community of souls who, although unaware of each other, are preparing to become bridges between ordinary consciousness and the consciousness of Christ during the upcoming transformation. The manuscripts of the monastery of St. Macarius contain a prophecy about the role that this invisible community will play. When the time comes, to make the final choice between spiritual evolution and material degeneration. These souls will serve as antennas that will help guide people in the right direction. The energies of transformation necessary for humanity to move to a new stage of its development are being revealed precisely in our time. The patristic texts answer this question by explaining that humanity has finally reached the spiritual and intellectual maturity necessary to understand and unite truths that in earlier times could have been misinterpreted or misused. Coptic traditions describe our time as a period of final revelation, when all the secrets preserved in various traditions finally come together into one, creating a comprehensive understanding that prepares humanity for the next stage of its spiritual development. The oldest manuscripts preserved in Eastern monasteries describe this moment as the return of Sophia, the feminine divine wisdom that was partially hidden during the patriarchal era of mankind, but is now returning in its entirety to balance and complete the masculine revelation that has dominated the last 2,000 years. Mary, as the bearer and guardian of this Sophia, continues to guide the process of gradual unfolding from the moment of her conception. She ensures that each soul receives exactly the truth that it can integrate at its current level of spiritual development. If you have come this far in this video, if these revelations have found a response in your heart that goes beyond mere curiosity, then it is possible that you are part of the invisible community that Mary is forming for the times to come.